There are moments when the soul grows tired of its own striving, when even prayer feels like a whisper lost in the wind. You kneel, but your words fall heavy, like stones that never reach heaven's door. You rise, and the silence of God seems louder than thunder. It is in that silence that weariness is born, the kind of weariness not of the body, but of the spirit. The world tells you to be strong, to keep pushing forward, to act as if you are made of iron. But heaven tells a different story. It tells of a God who listens, not to the proud and the perfect, but to those whose hearts tremble under the weight of being human. God listens to the weary not because they speak beautifully, but because they have nothing left to hide. When all strength is gone, when the last mask has fallen, when the voice breaks into tears instead of words, that is when God bends closest. For the language of the weary is not eloquence, but honesty. It is the sound of the heart's last confession, I cannot do this alone, and that, perhaps, is the truest prayer of all. Heaven does not demand that you roar your faith, it only asks that you whisper your truth. There is a strange and sacred power in weakness. The weary are not far from God, they are nearer than they think. For when the soul collapses, it collapses toward its Maker. When all the scaffolding of self-sufficiency falls away, only grace remains to hold what is broken. God is not deaf to your sighs, nor blind to your tears. The heart that aches in secret is heard in eternity. You may think your prayers vanish into emptiness, but every cry born from weariness travels farther than you imagine. Even Christ in the garden knew weariness. He prayed until his sweat became blood, not because he doubted the Father, but because he carried the full burden of human sorrow. He was weary for us that we might know that God understands the trembling heart. So when you kneel, exhausted and unsure, you kneel in the presence of one who has known every depth of despair and still listened to the faintest cry. We are taught to see weariness as failure, yet it is often the doorway to revelation. When all else is stripped away, we begin to see what cannot be shaken. God's attention is not drawn by our strength, but by our surrender. The weary soul is like a broken instrument, yet somehow heaven plays its most beautiful song through its cracks. You do not need to impress God, you only need to be real with him. The burdened heart is not a disqualification, it is an invitation. So if tonight your faith feels like a fading ember, know this: embers are all God needs to start a fire again. If your prayers are few and your tears many, remember that God reads tears better than he hears words. The silence that frightens you is not his absence, it is his listening. The stillness of heaven is not indifference, it is compassion waiting for you to breathe. When you can no longer run, walk. When you can no longer walk, stand. And when you can no longer stand, fall, for even in falling, you fall into the arms of God. The weary are not forgotten. They are the ones heaven holds dearest. There is no prayer too quiet, no sigh too small, no ache too hidden. God listens not merely to the voice, but to the soul behind it. And when the dawn comes, you will find that your weariness has not been wasted. For in your exhaustion, you have met the one who never sleeps. In your weakness, you have discovered a strength, not your own. The weary who keep believing, who keep whispering even when no answer comes, are the ones who do the impossible. They find peace not in the end of the storm, but in the presence of the one who walks upon it. God draws closest when the soul grows silent and weary. For honesty in weakness speaks louder than eloquence in strength. There are seasons when life presses upon the heart so heavily that even the air feels thick with exhaustion. In such moments, words of faith seem distant, and prayers sound like echoes fading into emptiness. The weary soul begins to wonder whether heaven still hears, whether God still watches, whether anything sacred still stirs within the silence. Yet it is within that silence that the divine ear bends closest, not to the confident nor the strong, but to those who can no longer pretend to be either. God does not delight in the polished prayers of the proud. He listens to the trembling honesty of the broken. When the soul grows silent and weary, when strength has been stripped to its last thread, the truth of the heart begins to speak. And that truth is what heaven has been waiting for all along. There is a kind of beauty that only weakness can uncover. It is not the beauty of triumph, but of surrender, not of victory, but of vulnerability. When one stands stripped of all pretenses, when all the armor of self-reliance is laid aside, there remains only the fragile truth of who we really are before God. That truth is what touches the heart of the divine. The weary do not speak in polished phrases. They speak in sighs, in pauses, in whispers of need. Their prayers may not reach the sky in sound, but they reach it in sincerity. It is not the volume of the prayer that moves God, but the depth of the heart behind it. The world admires strength and endurance, but heaven admires humility and honesty. It listens most intently to those who have reached the end of themselves, for that is the place where divine help begins. Weariness is not an obstacle to God's attention. It is a signal to His mercy. The faint heartbeat of faith, even when it feels too weak to matter, still resonates in the eternal. The soul that says, "I cannot go on," is not one that has failed. It is one that has spoken truth, and God is drawn to truth, for He Himself is truth. When your prayers dry up and you have nothing left to offer but tears, know that tears themselves are a language of the Spirit. They speak the words your mouth cannot form. The weary are fluent in that language, and heaven understands it perfectly. God does not turn away from weakness. He leans into it. The silence that follows a desperate prayer is not divine neglect. It is divine nearness, too deep for words. In that silence, something invisible happens. The weary heart begins to be held even before it is healed. The soul learns something profound in weariness that it could never learn in comfort. It learns that faith is not a performance but a relationship. When all the striving stops, when all the forced optimism fades, faith becomes raw and real. It is then that we discover prayer is not always about speaking, but about being heard. God's listening is not passive, it is active, like the stillness of a sea that reflects every trembling light. When you are too tired to pray, your mere turning of the heart toward God becomes prayer enough. He listens to what you meant to say, to what you wish you could say, to what your silence itself declares. For the weary, silence is not empty. It is sacred ground where the human meets the divine in wordless communion. We are often tempted to believe that God hears us best when we are at our best. But the opposite is true. When pride has melted away, when the soul admits its inability, then its cry becomes pure. The weary heart no longer tries to bargain with God, no longer tries to earn His favor, but simply collapses into honesty. That collapse is not failure, it is faith in its truest form. To be weary and still call out to God is to express a trust deeper than any eloquent declaration. It says, "Even though I cannot feel you, I still believe you are near." And that fragile belief, small as it may seem, echoes louder in eternity than the grandest proclamation of certainty in weariness. God's presence often hides beneath ordinariness. It is not the blaze of a burning bush, but the quiet company that never leaves. It is the peace that slips unnoticed into the cracks of despair. God listens not only to prayers, but to the rhythm of breathing, the slow heartbeat of one who still hopes, though hope feels impossible. The world may tell the weary to get up and try harder, but heaven whispers, "Rest and let me carry you." The weight that bends your shoulders is the very place where divine strength begins to lift. It is often in the dim light of exhaustion that the brightest truths are seen, that love is not earned by effort, that grace does not depend on perfection, that the ear of God is tuned to the faintest whisper of trust. The weary person does not approach God with confidence but with need, and that need is the truest door into his heart. When you come to him with nothing left, you come closer than ever before, for the soul that has lost everything but its cry is the soul that has finally found what cannot be lost. The world honors the unbroken, but heaven crowns the ones who dare to be honest about their cracks. Through those cracks, grace enters, and through them, light escapes to guide others who are weary too. Every sigh, every tear, every faltering word of faith becomes a thread woven into the fabric of divine compassion. God does not require strength to listen to you. He only requires sincerity. And when weariness strips away all else, sincerity is all that remains when the soul grows silent, when words fail, when the heart trembles beneath the weight of unseen burdens. That is when heaven leans close. The voice of the weary may not echo across mountains, but it reaches the heart of God because it is real. And in that quiet exchange, though unseen, something sacred takes place. The weary are heard, not because they are strong, but because they are true. The heart that trembles in the dark speaks a language that only God fully understands, and he listens, not from afar, but from within the silence itself. Weariness is not a sign of failure, but the doorway to divine encounter, where surrender replaces self-sufficiency. Weariness has a strange way of uncovering what lies beneath the surface of the soul. It peels back the layers of pretense and reveals the truth about who we are and what we truly depend on. The world has taught us that exhaustion is a weakness, that to pause is to fail, and that our worth is measured by how tirelessly we can continue to move. But there comes a point when the striving collapses, when the endless effort leaves us empty, and when our voices tremble under the weight of all we cannot control. In that place of quiet defeat, we discover that weariness is not the end of faith, but the doorway through which divine encounter begins. God meets us not in our display of strength, but in our honest surrender. When we finally admit we cannot do it alone, heaven begins to move in ways our own power never could. It is often in surrender that the greatest transformations occur. We spend so much of our lives trying to hold everything together: our plans, our image, our control, and in the process, we forget that God cannot fill a heart already full of self-sufficiency. Weariness breaks the illusion that we are capable of saving ourselves. It dismantles the walls we have built around our fears and allows grace to flow into places we thought were long beyond repair. What feels like failure is often the prelude to revelation. When you reach the end of your strength, you are standing at the threshold of something greater than yourself. God waits there, not to scold, but to carry. It is in the breaking that he rebuilds, in the silence that he speaks most clearly, and in the surrender that he does what our striving never could. The weary soul learns a truth that comfort often hides. That surrender is not giving up, it is giving over. It is not resignation, but realignment. When the spirit finally lays down its heavy burden of control, it does not fall into emptiness, but into the arms of one who has been waiting all along. In the quiet that follows surrender, the presence of God becomes unmistakable. There is no thunder, no grand display, just the still assurance that the one who formed the stars also holds the trembling heart. Weariness brings humility, and humility makes room for grace. When we are emptied of our own strength, the divine strength begins to flow freely. The very place of exhaustion becomes the altar where the human and the holy meet. The world tells us to fight against weariness, to hide it, to overcome it with louder ambition and relentless energy. But the spiritual truth runs in the opposite direction. When you cease fighting your weariness, when you stop pretending that you are fine, you create space for something sacred to happen. God's presence does not rush in with noise or spectacle. It enters quietly, like light filtering through broken glass. The cracks in your heart become the openings through which his compassion shines. The soul that surrenders does not lose. It gains sight of what was always near but never noticed. Weariness softens the heart and teaches it how to listen again, how to trust again, how to breathe again. In surrender, faith takes on a new shape. It is no longer about certainty or control, but about relationship and trust. When you no longer have the strength to plan your future or predict your outcome, faith becomes a simple, raw choice to keep believing that God is present even when nothing makes sense. This kind of faith is quieter but deeper. It no longer depends on emotions or visible results. It depends on character, on the unchanging goodness of the one who listens to the weary. The weary soul begins to see that divine love is not a reward for the strong, but a refuge for the broken. The hands that once tried to shape their own destiny now rest, open and unguarded, and in that openness, miracles take root. Weariness strips away the illusion that we are in control, but it also reveals that we were never meant to be. Our strength was always meant to have limits so that we might learn dependence. The divine design of exhaustion is mercy disguised as limitation. It reminds us that we are not gods but children, not masters but beloved dependents of grace. When we surrender to that truth, the burdens we carry begin to lighten, not because the circumstances change immediately, but because the weight is no longer ours to bear alone. The moment we release control is the moment we begin to taste the freedom of faith. The impossible begins to shift when we stop forcing outcomes and start yielding to divine timing. The weary heart, when surrendered, becomes a vessel for something far greater than human effort. In its weakness, it begins to radiate quiet strength. It no longer needs to prove itself or justify its place in the world. It finds its worth not in performance but in presence. There is a peace that comes when one accepts that being held by God is far more powerful than holding everything together. The weariness that once felt like defeat becomes the very soil in which new hope is planted. The tears that once felt wasted begin to water unseen seeds of grace. Surrender transforms suffering into sacredness, exhaustion into encounter, and despair into dependence on the one who cannot fail. As you walk through your season of weariness, remember that surrender is not a single act, but a rhythm, a continual laying down of what you cannot carry, and a continual lifting of your heart toward what you cannot see. Each sigh becomes a silent offering, each tear an unspoken prayer. You may not feel strong, but you are standing in the very place where divine strength flows most freely. The weariness that humbles you is the same weariness that allows you to be transformed. What you call weakness, heaven calls readiness. What you see as an ending, heaven sees as the beginning of real faith. For when the striving ceases and the surrender deepens, the impossible begins to unfold quietly within the heart that has finally let go. The weary who keep believing do the impossible. They find peace not in the end of the storm, but in the presence of the one who walks upon it. There is a sacred mystery in the way the weary continue to believe when there is no visible reason left to do so. It is not the strength of their faith that sustains them, but the strength of the one they trust in. When everything collapses and the storm roars louder than their prayers, something unexplainable happens within the heart that refuses to give up. It is the quiet defiance of a soul that says, even in tears, I still believe. Such faith does not remove the storm, but it transforms the one standing in it. The weary who keep believing do the impossible. They learn to find peace not in the calm, but in the chaos, not in the absence of pain, but in the presence of God who stands unshaken within it. Peace is not found when circumstances change. It is found when perspective changes. The world teaches that peace is a reward that comes after victory, but heaven teaches that peace is a companion that walks with you through battle. The weary discover this truth not in theory, but in experience. When every effort fails and all plans unravel, They begin to notice that the presence of God is still there, quiet yet unmistakable. It is not a rescue that always comes in the form they expect, but a reassurance that they are never alone. The miracle is not that the storm stops. The miracle is that they remain standing in the middle of it, sustained by something greater than human resolve. The weary who keep believing have learned that faith is not proven by what is seen, but by what is endured. To find peace in the presence of the storm is to realize that divine strength is not a shield from pain, but a light within it. The weary heart, pressed on every side, learns to see differently. The waves that once threatened to drown become the very rhythm that teaches surrender. The thunder that once terrified becomes the sound of heaven's reminder that even chaos obeys divine command. The one who walks upon the waters does not always still them immediately. Sometimes he calls the weary to step out upon them. To believe in that moment is to do the impossible, to choose faith over fear, trust over control, presence over panic. It is in that decision that peace takes root, not as a fleeting feeling, but as a quiet knowing that God's hand holds steady, even when everything else trembles. Those who have endured deep weariness carry a different kind of wisdom. They no longer speak of faith as a concept, but as a lifeline. They know what it means to pray without words, to hope without reason, and to love without strength. Their peace is not naive, it has been tested by fire. They have learned that faith is not about escaping the night, but about recognizing that even in darkness, the stars still shine. The weary who keep believing discover that what they once called an ending was in fact a beginning, a new way of seeing life not as something to be mastered but something to be entrusted. They realize that God's presence is not proven by comfort but by endurance, not by ease but by faithfulness. When peace comes to the weary, it does not arrive with a shout but with a whisper. It does not erase pain but transforms it into meaning. It is the stillness that settles in when one accepts that they are held by something unbreakable. The weary who continue to trust are not denying reality, they are choosing to see a deeper one. They understand that God is not only at the end of the journey, but in every trembling step along the way. Peace becomes the evidence of divine companionship, the proof that even when storms rage, the heart can rest in the certainty of being known and loved. This peace is not fragile. It is forged in the very fires that once threatened to destroy it. Faith that endures through weariness becomes a kind of quiet miracle. It is the miracle of standing when you thought you would fall, of breathing when the weight of despair pressed too hard, of hoping when logic said hope was gone. Such faith cannot be taught by comfort. It is born in the crucible of difficulty. The weary who keep believing discover that peace is not something they must reach for. It is something that reaches for them. It meets them in unexpected places, in the middle of a sleepless night, in the small kindness of a stranger, in the unexplainable calm that washes over them when they should by all reason be falling apart. That peace is not from the world. It is the echo of a divine promise that no storm can silence. The weary who find peace in God's presence become living testimonies of the impossible. Their calm confuses the world because it cannot be explained by circumstance. It is the kind of peace that stands when everything else falls, the kind that cannot be shaken because it is rooted in something eternal. They begin to carry a light within them, subtle yet unquenchable, and that light speaks without words to others who are weary too. It says, you can endure, you can trust, you can rest even here. Such peace becomes contagious. It multiplies quietly through every act of faith, every moment of unseen perseverance, every prayer whispered in darkness. The impossible becomes visible not in miracles of escape, but in the miracle of endurance. The weary who keep believing find that faith and peace are not rewards but relationships. They do not wait for everything to be perfect before resting in God. They rest because they have discovered that He is perfect even when life is not. They no longer chase after peace as something distant. They carry it within, anchored by the quiet assurance that God is near. The storm may continue, but its power over them is broken. They no longer need certainty to walk forward. They only need presence. For in the presence of the one who walks upon the storm, weariness turns into worship, and the impossible becomes possible. It is there, in that sacred stillness, where peace does not depend on the storm's end, but on the unchanging heart of the one who stands within it.